An American household can do almost everything right and still reach the end of the month wondering where the money went. The rent is paid, the lights are not left on all night, nobody is buying luxury clothes every weekend, and the family even tries to shop for groceries on sale. Yet somehow the checking account keeps shrinking faster than expected. The reason is often not one drama. A household budget usually leaks through small decisions that barely feel important at the moment. $7 at a convenience store, $12 because lunch was not packed, $20 spent replacing something that could have lasted another year, an extra grocery purchase because nobody remembered there was already one at home. None of these expenses feels dangerous by itself, but repeated week after week, they quietly weaken a small household budget. David and Linda had lived this way for years. They considered themselves reasonably careful with money. They did not carry large credit card balances, rarely bought expensive gadgets, and always looked for discounts. But one month, Linda decided to stop trusting the vague feeling that they were doing fine. She took a notebook and began writing down what left the household. $5 for coffee, $17 at the pharmacy, $14 for lunch because nobody had packed food, $7 to rent a movie, $23 spent on 2 things picked up while stopping at a store for toothpaste. None of the purchases looked serious, but when they were written together on one page, they told a different story. This simple habit resembled the thinking behind kakebo, a Japanese approach to household budgeting that encourages people to pay attention to what they spend and why they spend it. Linda immediately noticed something important. A banking app could tell her where money had gone, but writing the expenses down forced her to notice the moment money was leaving. That tiny difference made spending feel more deliberate. The next month, David and Linda changed the order of their decisions. In the past, they paid the major bills spent normally during the month and hoped something would be left over for savings. Usually very little was. This time, they looked at what the money needed to accomplish before the month began. Housing came first, then utilities, insurance, transportation, groceries, and the amount they wanted to protect for savings. Only after those priorities were visible did they decide what could safely be used for flexible spending. Nothing about their income had changed, but the money suddenly seemed less mysterious. They were no longer discovering the result of their spending after the fact. They were giving the money a job before convenience had the chance to use it first. David began noticing how often convenience created small purchases. He might walk into a store for a bottle of water and come out carrying chips, gum, and something from the checkout display. The total was rarely high enough to feel irresponsible, which was exactly why the habit had survived for years. He started introducing a small delay before buying anything that had not been planned. For inexpensive wants, he simply walked around the store for a few minutes before deciding. For larger purchases, he waited a day or two. He began asking whether the item was actually needed, whether something at home already performed the same job, and whether he would make a special trip tomorrow just to buy it. Many times the answer was no. The household was not becoming deprived. It was simply creating a little friction between desire and payment. And that small pause prevented surprising amounts of money from leaving. The same mindset soon reached the kitchen. Saturday mornings had always begun with Linda writing a grocery list. Chicken eggs, spinach, carrots, yogurt, bread. Then one weekend she did something embarrassingly simple before leaving the house. She opened the refrigerator and actually looked. 7 eggs were already there. 2 carrots were hiding in the vegetable drawer. Half a container of spinach needed to be used quickly. There was chicken in the freezer. 4 items disappeared from the shopping list before she had clipped a coupon or entered a supermarket. The household had not received a discount. It had simply stopped buying food twice. Linda began checking the freezer and pantry before every grocery trip, and over time, the shopping list became noticeably shorter. Sometimes the cheapest grocery store, she realized, was the kitchen itself. This also changed how David and Linda thought about large packages. David loved warehouse-style shopping because the price per ounce was usually lower. A huge package looked responsible. Then Linda began paying attention to what actually reached the table. Half a bag of salad ended up in the trash. A large tub of dip was opened once and forgotten. Some food became stale before the family could finish it. On the shelf, the bulk package had been cheaper. In the kitchen, it was not. The household started judging food by the amount actually consumed rather than the amount brought home. Large packages still made sense for foods they used constantly, but fresh items and specialty ingredients were different. Buying more only saved money when the extra quantity had a realistic future. That lesson led naturally into the way meals were planned. Linda had once treated each recipe as its own project. Cilantro belonged to tacos, cabbage belonged to one salad, mushrooms belonged to pasta, and green onions belonged to a specific dish. After the recipe was finished, the remaining ingredient often had nowhere to go. She began noticing a different logic in practical Japanese home cooking, where ingredients often move easily between several meals. A cabbage can appear raw in one dish, cooked in soup later, then stir-fried another evening. Mushrooms can join rice, noodles, eggs, or broth. Green onions can finish many meals rather than waiting for one specific recipe. Linda started asking a question before placing an ingredient in the cart. Where else can this go? An item that could serve 3 meals suddenly seemed more valuable than one that could serve only one. Leftovers changed for the same reason. In David and Linda's home, leftovers had always suffered from an image problem. Tuesday's chicken became Wednesday's reheated chicken, and by Thursday, nobody wanted to see it again. There could be several containers of perfectly edible food in the refrigerator, yet the family would still announce that there was nothing to eat and order takeout. Linda began treating leftovers as ingredients rather than failed meals. A small amount of chicken went into noodles. Cooked vegetables moved into an omelet. Rice became fried rice. A few pieces of meat could become part of a soup or bowl. The household no longer felt as though it was repeating dinner. It was building something new from food that had already been paid for. That difference mattered because every leftover used successfully replaced at least part of another purchase. The freezer became more useful too. Previously, food entered the freezer only when it was already close to becoming a problem. A package of meat might spend several days in the refrigerator, while everyone kept saying it would be cooked tomorrow. Only when someone became worried about the date would it be frozen. Linda reversed the timing. When a large package of meat came home, it was immediately divided. Some was kept for the next meal, some for later in the week, and the rest went into the freezer while it was still fresh. Extra rice was portioned instead of being left in one large container. Bread that clearly would not be finished quickly was frozen before it became stale. The freezer stopped being an emergency room for neglected food and became part of the household plan. That small change also created a kind of convenience David had not expected. One evening, he came home tired and was seconds away from ordering dinner. Then he remembered that rice and a portion of chicken were already waiting in the freezer. 10 minutes later, dinner was nearly finished. The household had always thought convenience meant buying prepared food or paying for delivery. Now, convenience could also mean making a decision 3 days earlier that made a difficult evening easier. Sometimes the least expensive convenience food is the food a household prepared for itself before it was needed. Linda also became more flexible about what the family ate. In the past, if a recipe required a particular vegetable, she bought it even when the price seemed unreasonable that week. The recipe was treated like a contract, but Japanese food culture's strong appreciation for seasonality suggested another way to think. The family did not need to copy Japanese dishes to borrow the principle. They simply allowed availability and price to influence the menu. If zucchini looked good and cost less, perhaps zucchini could replace another vegetable. If berries were expensive, another fruit might make more sense. If a recipe called for one leafy green but another was abundant and affordable, the meal could change slightly. The household had not lowered its standards. It had stopped allowing a rigid recipe to make every financial decision. The way food was served changed too. David had grown up believing dinner needed a large central protein, a steak, a full chicken breast, a large piece of fish. Vegetables and starches were supporting characters. But many Japanese meals distribute the work differently. A smaller portion of fish or meat may sit beside rice, vegetables, soup, tofu, pickles, or other dishes. The expensive ingredient still matters, but it does not need to fill half the plate. David and Linda began experimenting with the same idea. Instead of wondering how to afford larger portions of salmon, they served a smaller amount with rice, vegetables, and soup. Nobody left hungry, yet the most expensive part of the meal stretched further. It did not feel like deprivation because the plate still felt complete. Even the size of dishes began to matter. Large dinner plates had always seemed normal, but they created empty space, and empty space had a way of asking to be filled. Smaller bowls and side plates made moderate first servings feel natural. Anyone still hungry could take more, but food was less likely to be abandoned after being served. The savings from one meal were tiny, but frugality was beginning to reveal itself as a pattern of tiny things. A little less food served unnecessarily, a little less waste, a little more awareness. That awareness reached items outside the kitchen. David had a habit of throwing away things once they became inconvenient. A pen stopped writing smoothly, so it disappeared. A towel became worn, so it was replaced. A storage container lost its lid, so it went into the trash. None of those decisions seemed expensive. But Linda began thinking about the Japanese idea of motenai, the discomfort associated with wasting something that still has value. She did not interpret it as a rule that everything must be kept forever. Instead, she started asking whether the household had actually finished receiving value from an object. A worn towel might still work for cleaning. A container might still be useful for organizing small items. A shirt missing a button might need 5 minutes of repair rather than replacement. The distinction between old and useless became financially important. One morning, a kitchen drawer handle became loose. David's first thought was that the hardware looked old anyway, and perhaps the cabinets needed an update. Linda found a screwdriver and tightened the handle. The entire problem disappeared in 30 seconds. That moment became a small household joke, but it also changed the way they viewed replacement. A loose screw was not a new cabinet. A dull knife was not a new knife. A jacket with a missing button was not automatically a new jacket. Before replacing ordinary objects, the family began asking whether they could be cleaned, maintained, sharpened, tightened, repaired, or repurposed. Sometimes the answer was no, and replacement made sense. But often the original item still had years of useful life hiding behind a very small problem. They also became more careful with inexpensive possessions. David had always maintained the family car because it was valuable, but he rarely thought about maintaining pans, shoes, knives, fans, storage containers, or clothing. Individually, these things were cheap. Collectively, the household owned hundreds of them. When each one was neglected and replaced a little sooner than necessary, the total cost became significant. David began sharpening knives rather than replacing them, cleaning appliances before buildup caused problems, drying tools properly, tightening loose parts, and following care instructions. There was no receipt showing the savings because the savings appeared as purchases that never became necessary. A household can sometimes improve its budget not by buying cheaper things, but by buying the same things less often. Secondhand shopping became easier for Linda to accept as well. She needed a small bookshelf and instinctively opened a retail website. Then she checked local resale listings. Someone nearby was selling one in exactly the right size. It had one scratch, but the scratch did not stop it from holding books. She paid far less. The experience made both of them reconsider how much they had been paying simply for the word new. They became more selective rather than automatically buying used. But for tables, shelves, plant pots, basic furniture, and certain household items, previous ownership often changed nothing about the function. Later, they started selling things they no longer used. Money that had once moved only out of the house occasionally began moving back in. Organization became part of frugality too. One weekend, David went looking for scissors and found 6 pairs. There were several flashlights, duplicate tape measures, similar cleaning products, unused kitchen tools, and cables that nobody could identify. A large home had allowed the family to forget what it already owned. Smaller Japanese living spaces often make duplication harder to ignore simply because storage is more limited. David and Linda began applying the same constraint mentally. Before buying something, they checked whether the household already owned another item that could perform the job. It was surprising how often the problem was not that they lacked an object, but that they had forgotten where it was. Clutter was no longer just a space problem. It was hidden inventory, and hidden inventory was often purchased twice. They started favoring multi-purpose items for the same reason. Linda once considered buying a kitchen gadget designed to perform one very specific task. It was inexpensive and clever. Then she realized that a knife already did the job and another tool in the drawer could do it as well. The gadget would save perhaps 30 seconds and occupy space for years. That decision became a useful test for future purchases. Would the item meaningfully improve daily life, or would it become another object to store, clean, maintain, and eventually discard? One pan used for several dishes, one cleaner that worked on multiple surfaces, neutral clothing that combined easily reusable containers in standard sizes, and furniture with storage began to make more sense than specialized products that solved one tiny problem. Utility bills received the same treatment. David had always imagined that reducing electricity meant sitting in the dark or being uncomfortable in winter. Because that sounded miserable, he ignored the subject entirely. Then the household focused on waste rather than sacrifice. Lights in empty rooms were switched off. Filters were cleaned and maintained. The refrigerator was organized so nobody stood with the door open searching for something hidden. Heating and cooling were used more deliberately in the rooms people were actually occupying. Curtains were adjusted when they could help with temperature. Devices that did not need to run continuously were treated more thoughtfully. None of these changes transformed the bill overnight, but utility savings had one advantage over a one-time discount they could repeat month after month. Water became another example. David and Linda learned that some Japanese households reuse bath water for laundry, a practice connected to the way bathing commonly involves washing the body before entering the tub. They were not interested in copying the system exactly, and they did not need to. What mattered was the principle behind it. Before a resource is discarded, is there a safe second use? That question made them more attentive to leaking faucets. Unnecessary running water, laundry loads, and small daily routines. Once again, the saving from one decision was almost invisible. The repetition was what mattered. Eventually, Sunday evenings became a 15-minute household reset. David and Linda would check what food needed to be used, look at the week's spending, and notice anything around the house that needed attention. There was no giant spreadsheet and no 3-hour budget meeting. The refrigerator might reveal Wednesday's dinner. The notebook might show that convenience purchases had appeared several times. A loose button could be repaired before the shirt disappeared into the back of a closet. A nearly empty household product could be placed on the shopping list before someone accidentally bought 2 of them. The routine was simple, but it connected everything they had learned. Pay attention. Use what already exists. Notice waste while it is still small. Decide deliberately what happens next. David and Linda did not become perfect. They still went out to dinner. They still bought things simply because they wanted them. There were weeks when meal planning failed, food spoiled, and a takeout driver appeared at the door. But their idea of frugality had changed. It was no longer a punishment that began whenever money became tight. It became a form of household maintenance. Food was checked before more food came home. Ingredients were expected to perform more than one job. Leftovers were transformed instead of ignored. Meat was portioned before it was forgotten. Objects were repaired before replacements were ordered. Useful things were sometimes bought secondhand when new added little real value. Energy and water were used where they actually helped someone. Small expenses were noticed before they became invisible habits. None of those changes produced one spectacular saving. That was the most important lesson. The household budget did not improve because David found one magical trick that saved $500. It improved through dozens of small decisions that stopped money from disappearing unnecessarily. $5 kept 1 week, a duplicate grocery item not purchased, a $20 household object not replaced, a leftover turned into lunch, a utility bill made slightly smaller, a purchase delayed long enough for the desire to disappear, a piece of furniture bought used rather than new, an ingredient used 3 times instead of once. Repeated week after week, those decisions began to change what the same income could accomplish. That may be one of the most useful lessons Americans can borrow from Japanese frugal living. A household does not always need dramatically more money to make its budget feel larger. Sometimes it needs to lose less of what it already has. Money, food, objects, water, energy, and space all become more valuable when the household pays attention to how completely they are being used. David and Linda still look for sales. They still compare prices. They still enjoy the feeling of finding a good deal. But now they understand that a bargain is not created only at the checkout counter. A cheap package that gets thrown away is expensive. An old object that still works may be more valuable than a new replacement. A leftover may already be tomorrow's lunch. An empty shelf can be a sign that the refrigerator is under control, rather than a sign that the household is unprepared. The biggest change was not what they stopped buying. It was what they started noticing. Once a household begins noticing those small leaks, frugality stops feeling like a collection of restrictions. It starts looking like a way to make everyday life work more efficiently. The grocery bill becomes easier to understand. The home becomes easier to organize. Purchases become more intentional. Useful objects stay useful longer. Small expenses stop hiding inside normal routines. And eventually the question at the end of the month changes. Instead of asking, where did all the money go? The household begins asking something much more useful. How much of what we already had did we actually use well? That is where a small budget can begin to go much further.